So picture this. You are driving home late. It is like 3 a.m. The streets are completely deserted. You roll up to a red light,
Right.
and there are no other cars around. Right? No pedestrians, no traffic cameras. You could easily just press the gas and drive right through without a single consequence. But you stop.
You sit there waiting.
Exactly. You sit there, idling in the dark, just waiting for a literal light bulb to change color.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever wondered why you actually do that? Or, why every single year you willingly hand over a massive chunk of your hard-earned paycheck to the government in taxes?
Trusting that you're getting something in return.
Right. You just trust the system. And in answer to both of those things is this invisible, unsigned document that you, me, and everyone else on Earth are bound by. It's called the social contract.
Yeah, it's essentially the unseen operating system running in the background of our entire lives. I mean, we can't touch it. We never actually signed it in any physical sense, but it governs every single interaction we have with the state and with each other. Without it, the whole concept of society just completely falls apart.
So today, our mission for this deep dive is to really explore the origins, the evolution, and, well, the major controversies surrounding social contract theory.
It's a huge topic.
It really is. We are going to look at how different thinkers throughout history explain this massive leap that humans made. Like the decision to voluntarily trade away our natural absolute freedom in exchange for the rules, the safety, and, the benefits of a political order.
And we have a vast stack of sources to guide us today.
Yes, we do.
We're pulling from historical records, philosophical treatises, and legal documents that trace this concept all the way from ancient antiquity right up to modern constitutionalism. We'll be looking at everything from ancient Buddhist texts to modern game theory.
But to even begin to understand the rules of society, we first have to strip them all away, right? We have to imagine the human condition without any political order. So, no police, no laws, no courts.
Just a blank slate.
Yeah. And philosophers have a term for this theoretical baseline. They call it the state of nature.
Right. The state of nature is basically the ultimate control group for political philosophy. It serves as this hypothetical starting point.
Yep.
In this condition, individuals' actions are bound by absolutely nothing except their own personal physical power and their own conscience.
It's total freedom.
Total freedom. And the fundamental assumption here is that nature, in its rawest form, precludes mutually beneficial social relationships. So the burden on any social contract theorist is to demonstrate exactly why rational individuals would ever willingly relinquish that unrestricted freedom.
Well, before we get into the famous Enlightenment thinkers who, turned this into a massive field of study, we really have to recognize that humanity has been wrestling with this idea for thousands of years.
Oh, absolutely.
Early societies were already trying to conceptualize how we made this leap from lawless nature to structured society, and they had some pretty wild theories about it.
They really did. I mean, we can find early formulations of this contract in some of the world's oldest records. Take this Indian Buddhist text from the 2nd century BC. It's called the Mahavastu.
Okay, I'm not familiar with that one.
It's fascinating. It recounts this legend of a cosmic decay. According to the story, early humans lived on an immaterial plane. They were essentially dancing on air in a literal fairyland.
Wait, really? Floating humans?
Oh, yeah. They didn't need food, they didn't need clothing, private property, family, or government.
Wow, just floating around without a care in the world. I mean, that sounds like a pretty ideal setup.
It was perfect until, well, this cosmic decay set in. Humans became earthbound.
Ah, the catch.
Right. Suddenly, they had physical bodies that needed food and shelter. And the text describes how, as soon as they accepted the institution of private property and family out of pure physical necessity, the trouble began.
Because with property comes theft.
Exactly. With property came theft, and with family came adultery, murder, and just general chaos. So the people gathered together and made a very practical decision.
What do they do?
They appointed one man from among them to maintain order, and they called him the Great Chosen One, or Mahasamada. And in exchange for him acting as the enforcer, they promised to give him a share of the produce of their fields and herds.
That is a very direct transaction. You keep my neighbor from stealing my crops, and I will pay you a cut of those crops.
Simple as that.
It makes me think of a completely unmoderated multiplayer survival video game.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Right. Like when you first log into one of those servers,
Yeah.
It is incredibly fun having total freedom. You can build whatever you want, you wander anywhere, you take anything you find.
Until someone finds you?
Exactly. Right. The novelty wears off the absolute second. A stronger player comes along, destroys your base, and steals all your loot. And at that exact moment, everyone in the game suddenly agrees that they need a server admin to enforce some basic rules.
Even if it means they have to stop stealing loot themselves.
Right. The trade-off becomes worth it.
And that survival game dynamic perfectly mirrors how ancient Western philosophers viewed the arrangement too. Like in Plato's Republic, there is a character named Glaucon who argues that justice is literally nothing more than a calculation.
How so?
Well, he posits that doing injustice like stealing the loot and getting away with it is fantastic. But suffering injustice without the power to retaliate is agonizing.
Right, it's the worst feeling.
Yeah, so since the pain of suffering injustice outweighs the joy of committing it, humans realize they're just better off creating a system where neither happens.
So justice is not some glorious moral ideal handed down from the heavens, then. It is literally just tolerated as the lesser evil.
That's exactly it. In fact, Glaucon goes so far as to say that no person who is truly powerful enough to resist would ever submit to such an agreement.
Yes, why would they?
Right, they would be mad to give up their advantage. And Epicurus, in the 4th century BC, echoed this. He argued there is no such thing as absolute justice.
Only practical agreements.
Yeah, only practical pledges of reciprocal benefit made at various times and places. Basically, you promise not to harm me, I promise not to harm you.
Okay, but if the ancients just viewed this as a practical hack for, keeping your farm safe, how did the social contract turn into this massive, desperate matter of life and death?
The big shift.
Because as we move forward into the 17th century, the tone changes completely. It's like we leave the realm of practical compromise and enter a philosophy built entirely on terror.
Well, the stakes got higher because the world became more complex, right? And the potential for mass violence grew. This brings us to 1651 and a philosopher named Thomas Hobbes.
Ah, Hobbes.
Yeah. Hobbes was the first modern thinker to articulate a detailed contract theory in his book Leviathan. His view of the state of nature is legendary for being just terrifyingly grim.
Right, he had a very bleak outlook.
Very bleak. He described human life in this stateless condition as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Without a sovereign power, life was basically an endless war of all against all.
Because in Hobbes's view, total freedom includes the right to all things, right? Like, if I want your food, your house, or your life, I have a natural right to take it if I have the strength.
Exactly. So imagine living in a state of constant, paralyzing paranoia. Because of this terrifying anarchy, Hobbes argues that humans make a radical, desperate choice.
They sign the contract.
They contract with each other to establish a political community, yes. But to do so, they irrevocably surrender all their rights to an absolute sovereign.
Wait.
This could be one dictator or an assembly, but their authority must be absolute and unquestionable.
Okay, hold on. I have to push back on this logic.
Yeah.
Irrevocably surrendering every single right I have to an absolute ruler. That sounds suspiciously like joining a mob protection racket.
It does sound like that.
I mean, I'm giving up all my freedom to a potentially arbitrary tyrant just to avoid getting mugged by my neighbors. The cure feels significantly worse than the disease here.
Well, Hobbes actually anticipated that exact criticism.
Oh, he did?
He did. He openly acknowledged that the sovereign's edicts might be arbitrary and tyrannical. But he argued that any government, no matter how oppressive, is infinitely better than the state of nature.
Wow. He really hated the state of nature.
He was terrified of it. For Hobbes, the fear of violent death at the hands of your neighbor is the ultimate motivator. Humans need the terror of some power, as he put it, to force them to behave. You accept the tyrant because the alternative is getting murdered in your sleep for a loaf of bread.
So it is an extreme trade-off motivated by pure terror. But surely someone looked at Hobbes' absolute dictatorship and thought, oh, maybe we do not need a tyrant. Maybe we just need a referee.
Yes, and John Locke did exactly that in 1689.
Okay, so just a few decades later.
Right. In his second treatise of government, Locke offers a much softer, more optimistic take on human nature. He completely rejects the idea that the state of nature is an endless bloodbath.
So what did he think it was?
Instead, he believed individuals are bound by a moral law of nature. They inherently understand they shouldn't harm others, and they have a natural right to preserve what he called their life, liberty, and estate.
Okay, but if everyone naturally understands moral law, why do we need a government at all? Why leave the state of nature if it isn't a war zone?
Human bias.
Ah,
Think about it. In Locke's state of nature, if someone steals your cow, you have the natural right to punish them.
sure.
But humans make terrible impartial judges when they have been wronged. In your anger over the stolen cow, you might not just take a cow back. You might burn their entire farm down.
Yeah, things escalate quickly.
Exactly. When everyone acts as their own judge, jury, and executioner, punishments become disproportionate, blood feuds escalate, and property is never truly secure.
I see. So instead of surrendering all our rights to a terrifying Leviathan, like Hobbes said, Locke says we only surrender one specific right, the right to administer our own violent justice.
That's fair.
We delegate that solely to the government. They get the monopoly on violence, but only to act as an impartial referee protecting our life, liberty, and estate.
And this introduces a crucial limit on power that Hobbes completely rejected.
Which is?
Well, if Locke's referee starts breaking the rules, if the government starts stealing property instead of protecting it, the deal is broken.
The people can fire the referee.
The people have the right to fire the referee, yes.
Okay, so Hobbes and Locke are fundamentally debating who rules us and, how much power they get. But as we move into the 18th and 19th centuries, the conversation shifts from the ruler to the citizens themselves.
Right, it becomes much more internal.
Yeah, it becomes about how we relate to one another. So we meet Jean-Jacques Rousseau in 1762, and he introduces a totally different framework.
Rousseau is fascinating because he moves away from the stark individualism of Hobbes and Locke. He brings in a highly collectivist conception of society in his treatise, The Social Contract.
Right.
He argues that society should be based on the sovereignty of the general will.
The general will, meaning the collective interest of all citizens. And not just taking a poll of what everybody individually wants, but what is actually best for the community as a whole.
Exactly. Rousseau believed that a society is only legitimate when the people themselves, acting collectively, are the sole legislators.
Okay.
He demanded that the individual must accept the total alienation of himself and all his rights to the whole community. You give up everything to the collective, and in return, conditions are made equal for everyone.
Total alienation of my rights. That sounds intense. But then Rousseau has this famous, incredibly paradoxical phrase where he says, a man who disobeys the general will must be forced to be free.
Yes, forced to be free.
I am really struggling with that one. How can coercion ever be considered freedom?
I know, it sounds like a massive oxymoron to modern ears. But think about Rousseau's logic regarding popular sovereignty. When citizens come together to form the laws, they are deciding what is objectively good for the whole. If an individual later decides to act selfishly giving in to their baser instincts and breaking the law, they are actually betraying their own higher reasoning.
Oh, I see.
By forcing them to obey the law, the collective is forcing them to listen to the rational choice they made when acting as part of the body politic. The law isn't limiting their freedom, it is the ultimate expression of it.
Let me try to map this onto an analogy. It is kind of like being a musician in an orchestra.
Okay, let's hear it.
When you join the orchestra, you alienate your right to just play whatever notes you feel like. The collective sound of the symphony matters more than your individual desire to play a wild off-key solo.
Right.
So if you start playing totally offbeat during a performance, the conductor and the rest of the orchestra force you back into the rhythm. They're forcing you to be free, to be a functioning, harmonious musician within that group's agreed-upon sound.
That captures the collectivist spirit beautifully. You find your true freedom within the structure of the whole.
In a sense.
But naturally, not everyone wants to play in an orchestra. To see the extreme rejection of Rousseau's collective, we look to Pierre-Joseph Proudhon in 1851.
So Proudhon brings us an individualist, purely anarchist view of the contract. He essentially rejects the conductor entirely.
He absolutely does. Proudhon asked what a true social contract should actually look like. He argued it cannot be an agreement between a citizen and a government, nor can it be an individual surrendering to a collective general will.
So what is left?
For Proudhon, the social contract must be strictly an agreement of man with man, a lateral peer-to-peer agreement.
So complete personal sovereignty is maintained at all times.
Yeah.
Like, I promise not to coerce you, and you promise not to coerce me.
Yes. He wanted to replace distributive justice from a state with commutative justice.
Let's unpack that. What is the difference between distributive and commutative justice in this context?
Well, distributive justice is top-down. It's a central authority, like a state, deciding how resources, rights, and responsibilities are distributed among the population.
Okay, that's what we're used to.
Right. But commutative justice is horizontal. Think about buying a coffee.
Sure.
You voluntarily give the barista $4. They voluntarily give you the coffee. It is a direct, voluntary exchange of equal value between peers. Proudhon envisioned an entire society built solely on those voluntary commutative exchanges, with absolutely no one abdicating their power to govern each other.
Wow. We have traveled from Hobbes' terrifying absolute dictator to Locke's neutral referee to Rousseau's orchestra and now to Proudhon saying we just need lateral peer-to-peer trades.
Quite a journey.
It really is. And, it is easy to view these as abstract arguments sitting in dusty library books. But these ideas literally wrote the scripts for modern nations.
Oh, they were deeply practical. Look at the most famous real-world inking of these ideas.
Yeah.
The United States Declaration of Independence. The intellectual fingerprint of John Locke is stamped all over that document.
I mean, the phrase everyone knows, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that is almost a direct cover version of Locke's natural rights to life, liberty, and the state.
Yeah, it really is. Thomas Jefferson explicitly cited Locke in an 1825 letter, naming him alongside Aristotle and Cicero as the intellectual foundation of the text.
That's pretty clear evidence.
Yeah. The entire concept that all men are created equal and that no one ought to harm another in their life, health, liberty, or possessions, that is lifted straight from Locke's vision of the state of nature.
And it isn't just about the rights we possess either. Locke's framework defines what we can do when the referee turns into a tyrant, the right to revolt.
Exactly. Locke argued that whenever legislators try to destroy the property of the people or reduce them to slavery, the government fundamentally breaks the contract.
They violate the terms.
Right. They put themselves into a state of war with the people. And when that happens, the constituents are absolved from any further obedience. The Declaration mirrors this perfectly, stating that when a government becomes destructive, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it.
It wasn't just a political strategy.
No, they viewed it as a moral obligation stemming directly from social contract theory.
Which brings up a really interesting question for you and the listener to ponder. If the founders of modern republics heavily copy-pasted Locke's ideas into their constitutions, does that mean modern legal frameworks are inherently locked into a 17th century definition of property and liberty? Like, are we still running on Locke's beta software, or has the contract updated?
That's a great question. The theory definitely updates, and modern philosophers have developed fascinating new ways to apply it. In the 20th century, for instance, John Rawls used a contractarian approach to try and solve the problem of inequality.
Oh, how did you do that?
He proposed a thought experiment called the veil of ignorance.
The veil of ignorance. How does that work?
Well, imagine you are tasked with designing the rules of a brand new society, but you have a specific kind of amnesia.
Okay, I'm listening.
You do not know what your social status, wealth, race, gender, or physical abilities will be in this new world. You are completely behind a veil of ignorance.
Oh.
From that position, Rawls argued, rational people would agree to principles of fairness that protect the most vulnerable, because they might end up being the most vulnerable themselves.
That is brilliant. If I don't know if I'm going to be born a billionaire or, born into poverty with a chronic illness, I'm going to design a social safety net, just in case.
Exactly. It forces empathy through self-interest. Another modern update comes from David Gauthier, who used game theory, specifically the prisoner's dilemma, to explain why rational people stick to the contract.
Okay, the prisoner's dilemma. That's where two criminals are interrogated separately, right?
Right. If they both stay silent, they get a light sentence. If one snitches, the snitch goes free and the other gets a harsh sentence. If both snitch, they both get harsh sentences.
So the temptation is always to snitch to save yourself. But if you both do that, you both lose.
Yes. But Gauthier points out that if you play this game repeatedly over a lifetime, rational people realize that mutual cooperation yields the best long-term outcome.
Because you have to keep dealing with these people tomorrow.
Exactly. Trust and rationality keep them from breaking the rules because the overall benefit of the social contract is simply better than constantly betraying each other.
Does this theory only apply to Western democracies, or do we see the social contract used to analyze other parts of the world today?
Oh, it is used globally as a geopolitical analytical tool. Take the Arab world, for example.
Okay.
Economists use the concept to analyze the capacity of populations to accept economic change. In many Gulf states, there is an unspoken economic social contract.
How does that one work?
Well, the rulers maintain absolute political control. And in exchange, the citizens receive heavily subsidized living conditions. So no income tax, cheap energy, guaranteed public sector jobs.
So the people basically consent to authoritarian rule in exchange for a high standard of living. But what happens when the money dries up?
That is exactly where the theory gets tested. When energy prices fluctuate and governments are forced to cut subsidies or introduce taxes, they are unilaterally changing the terms of the contract.
Oh, I bet people don't like that.
They don't. This exerts massive pressure on the unspoken agreement between the rulers and the governed, often leading to public unrest.
Which perfectly brings us to the elephant in the room. We've talked about all these profound applications, but regardless of how elegantly Locke or Rawls designed these agreements, nobody alive today actually signed a piece of paper agreeing to the laws of the country they were born in.
Yes, the lack of a signature. Critics have been pointing this out for centuries. David Hume, writing in the 1700s, called the original social contract a convenient fiction.
A convenient fiction.
Yeah. He pointed out that while consent is a beautiful ideal, historically, governments almost never formed through polite agreements in a field. They formed through military conquest, usurpation, and bloodshed.
Right. So if there is no explicit signature, philosophers usually rely on the idea of tacit consent, right?
That's the usual fallback.
The theory goes that simply by remaining in the territory controlled by a state, you're giving tacit consent to join it and be governed by its laws.
Right, your physical presence is your signature.
But if tacit consent just means you live here, so you agree to everything the state does, isn't that exactly like saying you legally agreed to a website's 50-page terms and conditions just by looking at their homepage?
That is a very apt comparison.
I mean, you didn't read it, you couldn't negotiate it, you cannot realistically opt out, but you are supposedly bound by every single clause just because your browser loaded the site.
That terms and conditions analogy is spot on, and it is the exact angle modern legal scholars use to attack tacit consent.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Legal theorist Randy Barnett argues that mere physical presence in a territory does not mean you consent to tyranny. He argues that for tacit consent to be valid, the laws of the state must be consistent with underlying principles of natural justice.
That makes sense.
You cannot just lock someone in a room and say their failure to escape implies they consent to being beaten.
Yeah, that would be absurd. But if tacit consent is that flimsy, what actually legitimizes the state then?
Philip Pettit offers a very pragmatic alternative. He argues we should stop pretending citizens actively consent to the state. Instead, he proposes that a contract's only real legitimacy is simply the absence of effective rebellion against it.
Consent by lack of rebellion. So as long as people aren't actively rioting in the streets and overthrowing the Capitol, we assume they're okay with the arrangement.
That's the idea.
That is a very low bar.
It is a low bar, but perhaps the harshest critique comes from the strict perspective of actual contract law.
Okay, how so?
Lysander Spooner, a 19th century lawyer, totally dismantled the theory by applying the rules of the courtroom to the state. In modern law, a contract is only valid if all parties voluntarily agree to it without coercion.
Because you cannot hold a gun to someone's head, force them to sign a contract, and then expect a judge to enforce it.
Exactly. Spooner argued that the government initiates force against anyone who refuses to enter the contract.
Well, sure. If you decide you don't want to pay taxes because you never agreed to the contract, the state will use armed police to seize your property or put you in a cage.
Right. And because the state uses the threat of force, the agreement is inherently involuntary. Therefore, Spooner argued, the social contract cannot be considered a legitimate legal document.
I mean, that makes total logical sense under modern law. But did philosophers like Hobbes and Locke view contract law the same way we do today?
They didn't, which is a really important historical caveat.
Okay.
When Hobbes and Locke were writing, the legal understanding of a contract was quite different. They relied more on the concept of relational contracts.
What does that mean?
It's where the mutual exchange of benefits creates implicit obligations, regardless of an explicit voluntary choice. The idea of being bound by a societal arrangement that your distant ancestors formulated wouldn't have seemed quite as outrageous to a 17th century mind as it does to a modern lawyer.
Ah, I see.
The definition of a valid agreement has just evolved right alongside the political theory itself.
Well, to summarize this incredibly long journey,
Yeah.
we started with the ancient dread of the state of nature, where life was, terrifyingly precarious.
Very much so.
We saw Hobbes offer the absolute Leviathan as a brutal shield against that chaos. We explored Locke's desire for a neutral judge, which basically birthed the American Declaration of Independence.
Right.
We navigated Rousseau's Orchestra of the General Will, Proudhon's lateral peer-to-peer society, and finally, we wrestled with the modern critics who wonder if this entire contract is just a highly functional illusion held together by the threat of force.
And ultimately, whether you view it as historical fact, a legal fiction, or just a philosophical necessity, This invisible framework is the bedrock of every right you exercise and every rule you follow today. It defines the incredibly fragile balance between our individual desires and our collective survival.
It definitely makes you look at that red light at 3 a.m. a little differently.
I'm sure it does.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. We have spent all this time talking about how the contract evolved here on Earth, heavily influenced by our history and our geography.
Yeah.
But if humans successfully establish a new, completely isolated colony on Mars, would those astronauts automatically carry Earth's social contract with them in their minds? Or would the extreme deadly environment of Mars instantly revert them to the absolute state of nature, forcing them to draft a completely new agreement for survival from scratch?